of Deerfield Public Library Twitch channel. I'm Anne.
I'm Christina.
And today we continue our adventure through Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, the world's first sci-fi novel. So last time it was just me. So to remind all of you viewers and Christina what happened, Victor Frankenstein became absolutely and entirely and completely obsessed with the idea of creating life through electricity and also some chemistry stuff. He became so obsessed with this that he basically started ignoring everyone else in his life.
Lovely. Good
and
choices here.
in his attic, he created a guy basically from dead body parts. And the guy opened his eyes, and Victor Frankenstein felt the fastest case of buyer's remorse I've ever seen in my life. The monster opens its eyes, and Victor Frankenstein is like, I made a mistake. And then he immediately runs away from his mistakes, which is a pattern with him. What else are you going to do but run from your mistakes, Victor Frankenstein? You brought this thing to life. But while he's in the process of being like, what have I done? Good Lord, what have I done? He comes across his old friend Clerval, who he knew from growing up, and whose father has finally been convinced to allow Clerval to attend university. And I'm sure it won't go poorly for him at all. And he had a letter for him from his sister, who also is meant to be his wife. Just remember that. And that's where we left off.
All right, then.
Chapter 6.
Clerval then put the following letter into my hands. It was from my own Elizabeth. My dearest cousin, you have been ill, very ill, and even the constant letters of dear kind Henry are not sufficient to reassure me on your account. You are forbidden to write, to hold a pen. Yet one word from you, dear Victor, is necessary to calm our apprehensions.
I forgot to mention that because he was super sick, Clerval, like Henry, instead of actually getting to go to school, he basically spent the entire past 3 or 4 months nursing Victor Frankenstein, who doesn't deserve him. Just saying.
Dude.
Clerval is a saint. Anyways.
For a long time, I have thought that each post would bring this line, and my persuasions have restrained my uncle from undertaking a journey to Ingolstadt. I have prevented his encountering the inconveniences and perhaps dangers of so long a journey. Yet how often have I regretted not being able to perform it myself? I figured to myself that the task of attending on your sickbed has devolved on some mercenary old nurse who could never guess your wishes nor minister to them with the care and affection of your poor cousin. Yet that is over now. Clerval writes that indeed you are getting better. I eagerly hope that you will confirm this intelligence soon in your own handwriting.
Oh God, can you please send us a letter?
Get well and return to us. You will find a happy, cheerful home and friends who love you dearly. Your father's health is vigorous, and he asks but to see you. But to be assured that you are well, and not a care will ever cloud his benevolent countenance. How pleased, okay, I can't stop thinking about where is the monster though right now.
He's just kind of somewhere.
Okay, did he leave the attic? Is he in the attic?
He left the attic, and he was briefly in Frankenstein's room.
Okay.
And that's why Frankenstein was like, I gotta get out of here.
Okay.
And then he went to a hotel where Clerval happened to be stepping down.
Okay.
And then when he came back, he was like, you wait here. And he went upstairs, and the monster was gone. Okay. So at this point, we do not know where the monster is located.
Okay. I'm like, wait a minute.
Wait, they're just moving on.
I'm not ready to move on.
I'm not ready to move on. Anyways,
how pleased you would be to remark the improvement of our Ernest. He is now 16 and full of activity and spirit. He is desirous to be a true Swiss and to enter into foreign service, but we cannot part with him, at least until his elder brother returns to us. My uncle is not pleased with the idea of a military career in a distant country, but Ernest never had your powers of application. He looks upon study as an odious fetter. His time is spent in the open air, climbing the hills or rowing on the lake. I fear that he will become an idler unless we yield the point and permit him to enter on the profession which he has selected. Little alteration, the idler part, it reminded. One time I read like my horoscope or something, and it said like when it's like ideal jobs, and one of the jobs was beachcomber. What is that?
I didn't know that was an option. I should. Why am I here? I need to know.
But to be fair, I do love combing beaches.
Combing beaches is fun.
But I was like offended that was like my profession
option.
Yeah.
It's okay. One time I took a like career test
Yeah.
that told me I should either be a professor or a truck driver. There was like no in between. And I was like, okay, wait, I can get behind. Honestly, I could probably read a lot of audiobooks if I was a truck driver.
There you go. That must have been it. But I was like, professor, I feel like you like to talk to people and stuff. Truck driver, I feel like it's more solitary. Yeah.
Exactly. So, which is why I was like, Anyways, we don't want Ernest to become an idler or a beachcomber, apparently.
That's right.
Though I think he might enjoy the experience of beachcombing.
It is quite fun.
Yes.
Little alteration, except the growth of our dear children, has taken place since you left us. The blue lake and snow-clad mountains, they never change. And I think our placid home and our contented hearts are regulated by the same immutable laws.
It's been like 2 years since he's seen either of them, by the way. Like, he got so obsessed with the, like, create life thing.
Dang.
That, yeah, it's been like 2 years.
I'd be like, well, I'm done with him. Like, forget that guy.
No, you're forgetting. Elizabeth is for him. And also the only people she's been hanging out with are his dad and his little brother, who she has been raising since their mother died.
This is also weird. I don't like it.
You should. It's not going to end well for her.
My trifling occupations take up my time and amuse me, and I am rewarded for any exertions by seeing none but happy, kind faces around me. Since you left us, but one change has taken place in our little household. Do you remember on what occasion Justine Moritz entered our family? Probably you do not. I will relate her history, therefore, in a few words.
Thank you, Mary Shelley.
Madame Moritz, her mother, was a widow with 4 children, of whom Justine was the third. This girl had always been the favorite of her father, but through a strange perversity, her mother could not endure her, and after the death of Madame Moritz, Monsieur Moritz treated her very well. Yeah,
all the French like M's.
Yeah. My aunt observed this, and when Justine was 12 years of age, prevailed on her mother to allow her to live at our house.
She stole another kid. That's what happened.
What's wrong?
Frankenstein's mom just keeps stealing kids.
I don't remember any of this.
It didn't. They didn't cover it at all. That's why it's coming up now, and you're relating your history.
But I mean, in like my previous readings of Frankenstein, I don't remember this weird family.
I mean, who wants to bet? She's supposed to marry Ernest.
I don't like it. I'm done.
No, keep reading. That's why we're here. Anyways, Justine Moritz entered their household because Victor Frankenstein's mom stole another kid.
Yes. The Republican institutions of our country have produced simpler and happier manners than those which prevail in the great monarchies that surround it. Hence, there is less distinction between the several classes of its inhabitants, and the lower orders, being neither so poor nor so despised. Their manners are more defined and moral.
Sure.
A servant in Geneva does not mean the same thing as a servant in France and England. Justine, thus received in our family, learned the duties of a servant, a condition which, in our fortunate country, does not include the idea of ignorance and a sacrifice of the dignity of a human being.
All right, well, this one apparently was not as pretty as Elizabeth.
Justine, you may remember, was a great favorite of yours, and I'm
surprised we're hearing of it.
And I recollect you once remarked that if you were in an ill humor, one glance from Justine could dissipate it. For the same reason that Ariosto gives concerning the beauty of Angelica, she looked so frank-hearted and happy. My aunt conceived a great attachment for her, by which she was induced to give her an education superior to that which she had at first intended. This benefit was fully repaid. Justine was the most grateful little creature in the world. I do not mean that she made any professions. I never heard one pass her lips, but you could see by her eyes that she almost adored her protectress. Although her disposition was gay and in many respects inconsiderate, yet she paid the greatest attention to every gesture of my aunt. She thought her the model of all excellence and endeavored to imitate her phraseology and manners. so that even now she often reminds me of her. When my dearest aunt... Okay, if the little brother's supposed to marry this girl and she is like a mini aunt, like mini mom, weirder.
Probably not based on the fact that she was brought in to be a servant, but then now it could still be because she liked her enough to be like, I'm gonna teach you more. But honestly, here to say I think that Justine's lesbian, so.
Do we hear more of her?
I don't think so.
Oh, okay.
But
I was like, is there more evidence?
No,
to this?
her
This
disposition was gay though. So,
okay.
And she never made professions, but adored her protectress and tried to model herself after her.
Okay.
Just saying. Anyways, then she dies.
Justine does? No. When my dearest aunt died, everyone was too much occupied in their own grief to notice poor Justine, who had attended her during her illness with the most anxious affection. Poor Justine was very ill, but other trials were reserved for her. One by one, her brothers and sister died, and her mother, with the exception of her neglected daughter, was left childless. The conscience of the woman was troubled. She began to think that the deaths of her favorites was a judgment from heaven to chastise her partiality.
Sure, let's go with that.
She was a Roman Catholic, and I believe her confessor confirmed the idea which she had conceived. Accordingly, a few months after your departure for Ingolstadt, Justine was called home by her repentant mother. Poor girl, she wept when she quitted our house. She was much altered since the death of my aunt. Grief had given softness and a winning mildness to her manners, which had before been remarkable for her vivacity. Vivacity? Nor was her residence at her mother's house of a nature to restore her gaiety. The poor woman was very vacillating in her repentance. She sometimes begged Justine to forgive her unkindness, but much oftener accused her of having caused the deaths of her brothers and sister. Wild. Perpetual fretting at length drew Madame Moritz into a decline, which at first increased her irritability, but she is now at peace forever. She died on the first approach of cold weather at the beginning of this last winter. Justine has just returned to us, and I assure you, I love her tenderly. She is very clever and gentle and extremely pretty. As I mentioned before, her mien, and her expression continually remind me of my dear aunt.
I'm now starting to question Elizabeth a little bit. Also, did Justine's mom conveniently die, or did she make that happen? Just saying.
I must say, also a few words to you, my dear cousin, of little darling William. I wish you could see him. He is very tall of his age, with sweet, laughing blue eyes, dark eyelashes, and curling hair. When he smiles, 2 little dimples appear on each cheek, which are rosy with health. He has already had 1 or 2 little wives, but Louisa Biron is his favorite, a pretty little girl of 5 years of age.
It's the youngest brother, I think.
Okay. Now, dear Victor, I dare say you wish to be indulged in a little gossip concerning the good people of Geneva. The pretty Miss Mansfield has already received the congratulatory visits on her approaching marriage with a young Englishman, John Melbourne, Esquire. Her ugly sister, Manon, married Monsieur Duvillard, the rich banker, last autumn.
Elizabeth is so mean.
Damn.
That's just so mean. Yeah, the pretty one is marrying an Englishman who is a lawyer, I think, Esquire.
Yeah.
The ugly one married a banker. Like, did we have to describe her like that? Anyways.
Your favorite schoolfellow, Louis Manoir, has suffered, I did not take French, has suffered several misfortunes since the departure of Clerval from Geneva. But he has already recovered his spirits and is reported to be on the point of marrying a lively, pretty French woman, Madame Tavernier. She is a widow and much older than Manoir.
I think it's like Tavernier and Manoir. But I also didn't take French.
But she is very much admired and a favorite with everybody. I have written myself into better spirits, dear cousin, but my anxiety returns upon me as I conclude. Write, dearest Victor, 1 line, 1 word will be a blessing to us. 10,000 thanks to Henry for his kindness, his affection, and his many letters. We are sincerely grateful. Adieu, my cousin. Take care of yourself, and I entreat you, write. Elizabeth Lavenza, Geneva, March 18, 17. Dear, dear Elizabeth, I exclaimed when I had read her letter. I will write instantly and relieve them from the anxiety they must feel, I wrote, and this exertion greatly fatigued me. But my convalescence had commenced and proceeded regularly. In another fortnight, I was able to leave my chamber. One of my first duties on my recovery was to introduce Clerval to the several professors of the university.
Oh my God, at least he's doing something nice for his friend who took care of him in his sickness.
In doing this, I underwent a kind of rough usage, ill-befitting the wounds that my mind has sustained. Ever since the fatal night, the end of my labors and the beginning of my misfortunes, I had conceived a violent antipathy, even to the name of natural philosophy. When I was otherwise quite restored to health, the sight of a chemical instrument would renew all the agony of my nervous symptoms. Henry saw this and had removed all my apparatus from my view. He had also changed my apartment, for he perceived that I had acquired a dislike for the room, which had previously been my laboratory. But these scares of Clerval were made of no avail when I visited the professors. Monsieur Waldman inflicted torture when he praised, with kindness and warmth, the astonishing progress I had made in the sciences. He soon perceived that I disliked the subject, but not guessing the real cause, he attributed my feelings to modesty and changed the subject from my improvement to the science itself, with a desire, as I evidently saw, of drawing me out. What could I do? He meant to please, and he tormented me. Poor Victor.
I mean, yeah, he could have like maybe said, hey, I accidentally created a monster. Could you maybe help me with that, Professor?
I felt as if he had placed carefully, one by one, in my view, those instruments which were to be afterwards used in putting me to a slow and cruel death. I writhed under his words, yet dared not exhibit the pain I felt. Clerval, whose eyes and feelings were always quick in discerning the sensations of others, declined the subject, alleging, in excuse, his total ignorance, and the conversation took a more general turn. I thanked my friend from my heart, but I did not speak. I saw plainly that he was surprised, but he never attempted to draw my secret from me, and although I loved him with a mixture of affection and reverence that knew no bounds, yet I could never persuade myself to confide in him that event which was so often present to my recollection, but which I feared the detail to another would only impress more deeply. Monsieur Krempe was not equally docile, and in my condition at the time of almost insupportable sensitiveness, his harsh, blunt encomiums gave me even more pain than the benevolent.
Yeah, there's a lot of like, I mean, she's definitely got a style.
Yeah.
Benevolent approbation.
Benevolent. That word always reminds me of like anemone, like
Anemone.
little, like Nemo and
Benevolent.
benevolent.
Anyways,
approbation of Monsieur Waldman.
damn the fellow.
Oh. I was like, what's that dash in the middle?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I guess like at the time they didn't like swear in the written word. So apologies. It is time. Damn the fellow.
Damn the fellow, cried he. Why, Monsieur Clerval, I assure you he has outstripped us all. Stare if you please, but it is nevertheless true. A youngster who, but a few years ago, believed in Cornelius Agrippa as firmly as in the gospel, has now set himself as the head of the university. And if he is not soon pulled down, we shall all be out of countenance. Continued he, observing my face expressive of suffering. Monsieur Frankenstein is modest, an excellent quality in a young man. Young men should be diffident of themselves, you know. Monsieur Clerval, I was myself when young, but that wears out in a very short time. Monsieur Krempe yeah, had now commenced an eulogy on himself, which happily turned the conversation from a subject that was so annoying to me.
After you speak of science, when you meet the scientists.
Yeah. Clerval had never sympathized in my... Okay, is Clerval going into, like, University for Science?
No, he's more like poetry.
Okay.
And history.
Okay.
He's the liberal arts.
Got it. I just wondered...
Frankenstein is dumb.
Okay,
But
cool.
who does Frankenstein know? The natural philosophy people.
That's fair. That's what I thought, but I was like, because earlier when it's like Clerval says he doesn't know anything about science, I was like, he's not going into science,
No.
is he? Because like, you don't admit that.
That's why his dad didn't want to let him go to university, was because he knew he would just be like studying poetry, and he's like, that's useless to me. Stop doing that.
Clerval had never sympathized in my taste for natural science, and his literary pursuits differed wholly from those which had occupied me. He came to the university with the design of making himself complete master of the Oriental languages, and thus he should open a field for the plan of life he had marked out for himself. Resolved to pursue no inglorious career, he turned his eyes toward the east, as affording scope for his spirit of enterprise. The Persian, Arabic, and Sanskrit languages engaged his attention, and I was easily induced to enter on the same studies. Idleness had never been irksome to me, and now that I wished to fly from reflection and hated my former studies, I felt great relief in being the fellow pupil with my friend. Not only instruction, but consolation in the works of the Orientalists. I did not, like him, attempt a critical knowledge of their dialects, for I did not contemplate making any other use of them than temporary amusement. I ran merely to understand their meaning, and they well repaid my labors. The melancholy is soothing, and their joy elevating, to a degree I never experienced in studying the authors of any other country. When you read their writings, life appears to consist in a warm sun and a garden of roses, in the smiles and frowns of a fair enemy, and the fire that consumes your own heart. How different from the manly and heroical poetry of Greece and Rome.
We are reading this, but we do not approve of Victor Frankenstein's views in this map.
Correct. Summer passed away in these occupations, and my return to Geneva was fixed for the latter end of autumn. But being delayed by several accidents, winter and snow arrived. The roads were deemed impassable, and my journey was retarded until the ensuing spring. I felt this delay very bitterly, for I longed to see my native town and my beloved friends. My return had only been delayed so long from an unwillingness to leave Clerval in a strange place before he had become acquainted with any of its inhabitants. The winter, however, was spent cheerfully, and although the spring was uncommonly late, when it came, its beauty compensated for its dilatoriness. The month of May had already commenced, and I expected the letter daily, which was to fix the date of my departure, when Henry proposed a pedestrian tour in the environs of Ingolstadt, that I might bid a personal farewell to the country I had so long inhabited. I ceded with pleasure to this proposition. I was fond of exercise, and Clerval had always been my favorite companion in the ramble of this nature that I had taken among the scenes of my native country. We passed a fortnight in these perambulations. My health and spirits had long been restored, and they gained additional strength from the salubrious air I breathed, the natural incidents of our progress, and the conversation of my friend. Study had before secluded me from the intercourse of my fellow creatures, and rendered me unsocial, but Clerval called forth the better feelings of my heart. He again taught me to love the aspect of nature and the cheerful faces of children. Excellent.
Victor Frankenstein and Henry Clerval are the perfect example of the extrovert has adopted the introvert and now drags them everywhere. Because Clerval's like, come, see the people, talk to them. And Frankenstein's like, how about I don't?
Excellent friend. How sincerely you did love me and endeavor to elevate my mind until it was on a level with your own. A selfish pursuit had cramped and narrowed me until your gentleness and affection warmed and opened my senses. I became the same happy creature who, a few years ago, loved and beloved by all, had no sorrow or care. When happy, inanimate nature had the power of bestowing on me the most delightful sensations. A serene sky and verdant fields filled me with ecstasy. The present season was indeed divine. The flowers of spring bloomed in the hedges, while those of summer were already in bud. I was undisturbed by thoughts which during the preceding year had pressed upon me, notwithstanding my endeavors to throw them off with an invincible burden. Henry rejoined in my gaiety and sincerely sympathized in my feelings. He exerted himself to amuse me, while he expressed the sensations that filled his soul. The resources of his mind on this occasion were truly astonishing. His conversation was full of imagination, and very often, in imitation of the Persian and Arabic writers, he invented tales of wonderful fancy and passion. At other times, he repeated my favorite poems or drew me out into arguments, which he supported with great ingenuity. We returned to our college on a Sunday afternoon. The peasants were dancing, and everyone we met appeared gay and happy. My own spirits were high, and I bounded along with feelings of unbridled joy and hilarity. Chapter 7. On my return, I found the following letter from my father. My dear Victor, you have probably waited impatiently for a letter to fix the date of your return to us, and I was at first tempted to write only a few lines, merely mentioning the day on which I should expect you. But that would be a cruel kindness, and I dare not do it. What would be your surprise, my son, when you expected a happy and glad welcome to behold, on the contrary, tears and wretchedness? Oh, how, Victor, can I relate our misfortune? Absence cannot have rendered you callous to our joys and griefs, and how shall I inflict pain on my long-absent son? I wish to prepare you for the woeful news, but I know it is impossible. Even now your eye skims over the page to seek the words which are to convey to you the horrible tidings. William is dead, that sweet child whose smiles delighted and warmed my heart, who was so gentle yet so gay. Victor, he is murdered. I will not attempt to console you, but will simply relate the circumstances of the transaction. Last Thursday, May 7th, I, my niece, and your two brothers went to walk in Plain Palais. The evening was warm and serene, and we prolonged our walk further than usual. It was already dusk before we thought of returning, and then we discovered the William and Ernest who had gone on before were not to be found. We accordingly rested on a seat until they should return. Presently, Ernest came and inquired if we had seen his brother. He said that he had been playing with him, that William had run away to hide himself, and that he had vainly sought for him, and afterwards waited for a long time, but that he did not return. This account rather alarmed us, and we continued to search for him until night fell, when Elizabeth conjectured that he might have returned to the house. He was not there. We returned again with torches, for I could not rest, when I thought that my sweet boy had lost himself, and was exposed to all the damps and dews of the night. Elizabeth also suffered extreme anguish. About 5 in the morning, I discovered my lovely boy, whom the night before I had seen blooming and active in health, stretched on the grass, livid and motionless. The print of the murderer's finger was on his neck. He was conveyed home, and the anguish that was visible in my countenance betrayed the secret to Elizabeth. She was very earnest to see the corpse. At first I attempted to prevent her, but she persisted, and entering the room where it lay, hastily examined the neck of the victim, and clasped her hands, exclaimed, "Oh God, I have murdered my darling child." She fainted and was restored with extreme difficulty. When she again lived, it was only to weep and sigh. She told me that same evening, William had teased her to let him wear a very valuable miniature that she possessed of your mother. This picture is gone, and was doubtless the temptation which urged the murderer to the deed. We have no trace of him at present, although our exertions to discover him are unremitted, but they will not restore my beloved William. Come, dearest Victor, you alone can console Elizabeth. She weeps continually and accuses herself unjustly as the cause of his death. Her words pierce my heart. We are all unhappy, but will not that be an additional motive for you, my son, to return and be our comforter? Your dear mother, alas, Victor, I now say, thank God she did not live to witness the cruel, miserable death of her youngest darling. Come, Victor, not brooding thoughts of vengeance against the assassin, but with feelings of peace and gentleness that will heal instead of festering the wounds of our minds. Enter the house of mourning, my friend, but with kindness and affection for those who love you, and not with hatred for your enemies. Your affectionate and afflicted father, Alphonse Frankenstein, Geneva, May 12, 17. Clerval, who had watched my countenance as I read this letter, was surprised to observe the despair that had succeeded the joy I at first expressed on receiving news from my friends. I threw the letter on the table and covered my face with my hands. "My dear Frankenstein," exclaimed Henry, when he perceived me weep with bitterness, "are you always to be unhappy? My dear friend, what has happened?"
He created unholy life. So yes, he is doomed to always be unhappy. That is the point of the story, Clerval. I know you're in it, but I need to tell you.
I motioned him to take up the letter while I walked up and down the room in the extremest agitation. Tears also gushed from the eyes of Clerval as he read the account of my misfortune. "I can offer you no consolation, my friend," he said. "Your disaster is irreparable. What do you intend to do?" "To go instantly to Geneva. Come with me, Henry, to order the horses." During our walk, Clerval endeavored to say a few words of consolation. He could only express his heartfelt sympathy. Poor William, he said, dear lovely child. He now sleeps with his angel mother, who that had seen him bright and joyous in his young beauty, but must weep over his untimely loss. To die so miserably, to feel the murderer's grasp. How much more a murder that could destroy radiant innocence. Poor little fellow. One only consolation have we. His friends mourn and weep, but he is at rest. The pain is over. His sufferings are at an end forever. A sod covers his gentle form, and he knows no pain. He can no longer be a subject for pity. We must reserve that for his miserable survivors. Clerval spoke thus as we hurried through the streets. The words impressed themselves on my mind, and I remembered them afterwards in solitude. But now, as soon as the horses arrived, I hurried into a cabriolet, and bade farewell to my friend. My journey was very melancholy. At first I wished to hurry on, for I longed to console and sympathize with my loved and sorrowing friends. But when I drew near my native town, I slackened my progress. I could hardly sustain the multitude of feelings that crowded into my mind. I passed through scenes familiar to my youth, but which I had not seen for nearly 6 years. Oh, that is a long time. How altered everything might be during that time. One sudden and desolating change had taken place, but 1,000 little circumstances might have by degrees worked other alterations, which although they were done more tranquilly, might not be the less decisive. Fear overcame me. I dared no advance, dreading 1,000 nameless evils that made me tremble, although I was unable to define them. I remained 2 days at Lausanne in this painful state of mind. I contemplated the lake. The waters were placid, all around was calm, and the snowy mountains, the places of nature, were not changed. By degrees, the calm and heavenly scene restored me, and I continued my journey towards Geneva. The road ran by the side of the lake, which became narrower as I approached my native town. I discovered more distinctly the black sides of Jura and the bright summit of Mont Blanc. I wept like a child. Dear mountains, my own beautiful lake, how do you welcome your wanderer? Your summits are clear, the sky and lake are blue and placid. Is this to prognosticate peace or to mock at my unhappiness? I fear, my friend, that I shall render myself tedious by dwelling on these preliminary circumstances, but they were days of comparative happiness, and I think of them with pleasure. My country, my beloved country, who but a native can tell the delight I took in again beholding thy streams, thy mountains, and more than all, thy lovely lake. Yet as I drew nearer home, grief and fear again overcame me. Night also closed around, and when I could hardly see the dark mountains, I felt still more gloomily. The picture appeared as a vast and dim scene of evil, and I foresaw obscurely that I was destined to become the most wretched of human beings. Alas, I prophesied truly, and failed only in one single circumstance, that in all the misery I imagined and dreaded, I did not conceive the 100th part of the anguish I was destined to endure. It was completely dark when I arrived in the environs of Geneva. The gates of the town were already shut, and I was obliged to pass the night at Secheron? I don't know if the CH is hard or not. A village at the distance of half a league from the city. The sky was serene, and as I was unable to rest, I resolved to visit the spot where my poor William had been murdered.
Weird vibe, but okay.
As I could not pass through the town, I was obliged to cross the lake in a boat to arrive at Plainpalais. During this short voyage, I saw the lightning playing on the summit of Mont Blanc in the most beautiful figures. The storm appeared to approach rapidly, and on landing I ascended a low hill that I might observe its progress. In advance, the heavens were clouded, and I soon felt the rain coming slowly in large drops, but its violence quickly increased. I quitted my seat and walked on, although the darkness and storm increased every minute, and the thunder burst with a terrific clash over my head. It was echoed from Salive, the Juras, and the Alps of Savoy. Vivid flashes of lightning dazzled my eyes, illuminating the sky, making it appear like a vast sheet of fire. Then, for an instant, everything seemed of a pitchy darkness, until the eye recovered itself from the preceding flash. The storm, as is often the case in Switzerland, appeared at once in various parts of the heavens. The most violent storm hung exactly north of the town, over the part of the lake which lies between the promontory of Bellerive and the village of Coppet. Another storm enlightened Jura with faint flashes, and another darkened and sometimes disclosed the Mole, a peaked mountain to the east of the lake.
While I watched the tempest, so beautiful yet terrific, I wandered on with a hasty step. This noble war in the sky elevated my spirits. I clasped my hands and exclaimed aloud, "William, dear angel, this is thy funeral, this thy dirge." As I said these words, I perceived in the gloom a figure, which stole from behind a clump of trees near me. I stood fixed, gazing intently. I could not be mistaken. A flash of lightning illuminated the object, and discovered its shape plainly to me. Its gigantic stature, and the deformity of its aspect, more hideous than belongs to humanity, instantly informed me that it was the wretch, the filthy demon to whom I had given life. What did he there? Could he be, I shuddered at the conception, the murderer of my brother? No sooner did that idea cross my imagination than I became convinced of its truth. My teeth chattered and I was forced to lean against a tree for support. The figure passed me quickly and I lost it in the gloom. Nothing in human shape could have destroyed the fair child. He was the murderer. I could not doubt it. The mere presence of the idea was an irresistible proof of the fact. I thought of pursuing the devil, but it would have been in vain, for another flash discovered him to me hanging among the rocks of the nearly perpendicular ascent of Mount Salib, a hill that bounds Plain Palais on the south. He soon reached the summit and disappeared. I remained motionless. The thunder ceased, but the rain still continued, and the scene was enveloped in an impenetrable darkness. I resolved in my mind the events which I had until now sought to forget, the whole train of my progress towards the creation, the appearance of the works of my own hands at my bedside, its departure. 2 years had now nearly elapsed since the night on which he first received life, and was this his first crime? Alas, I had turned loose into the world a depraved wretch whose delight was in carnage and misery. Had he not murdered my brother? I don't know that. I mean, but probably. No one can conceive the anguish I suffered during the remainder of the night, which I spent cold and wet in the open air. But I did not feel the inconvenience of the weather. My imagination was busy in scenes of evil and despair. I considered the being whom I had cast among mankind, and endowed with the will and power to effect purposes of horror, such as the deed which he had now done, merely in the light of my own vampire, my own spirit let loose from the grave, and forced to destroy all that was dear to me. Day dawned, and I directed my steps towards the town. The gates were open, and I hastened to my father's house. My first thought was to discover what I knew of the murderer, and cause instant pursuit to be made. But I paused when I reflected on the story that I had to tell. A being whom I myself had formed and endued with life had met me at midnight among the precipices of an inaccessible mountain. I remembered also the nervous fever with which I had been seized just at the time that I dated my creation, which would give an air of delirium to a tale otherwise so utterly improbable. I well knew that if any other had communicated such a relation to me, I should have looked upon it as the ravings of insanity. Besides, the strange nature of the animal would elude all pursuit, even if I were so far credited as to persuade my relatives to commence it. And then, of what use would he pursue? Who could arrest a creature capable of scaling the overhanging sides of Mount Salib? These reflections determined me, and I resolved to remain silent. It was about 5 in the morning when I entered my father's house. I told the servants not to disturb the family and went into the library to attend their usual hour of rising. 6 years had elapsed, passed in a dream but for one indelible trace, and I stood in the same place where I had last embraced my father before my departure to Ingolstadt. Beloved and venerable parent, he still remained to me. I gazed on the picture of my mother, which stood over the mantelpiece. It was a historical subject painted at my father's desire, and represented Caroline Beaufort in an agony of despair, kneeling by the coffin of her dead father. Weird. Her garb was rustic and her cheek pale, but there was an air of dignity and beauty that hardly permitted the sentiment of pity. Below this picture was a miniature of William, and my tears flowed when I looked upon it. While I was thus engaged, Ernest entered. He had heard me arrive and hastened to welcome me. "Welcome, my dearest Victor," said he. "Ah, I wish you had come 3 months ago, and then you would have found us all joyous and delighted. You come to us now to share a misery which nothing can alleviate, yet your presence will, I hope, revive our father, who seems sinking under his misfortune, and your persuasions will induce poor Elizabeth to cease her vain and tormenting self-accusations. Poor William, he was our darling and our pride." Tears unrestrained fell from my brother's eyes. A sense of mortal agony crept over my frame. Before, I had only imagined the wretchedness of my desolated home. The reality came on me as a new and a not less terrible disaster. I tried to calm Ernest. I inquired more minutely concerning my father, and here I named my cousin. "She, most of all," said Ernest, "requires consolation. She accused herself of having caused the death of my brother, and that made her very wretched. But since the murderer has been discovered, good God, how can that be? Who could attempt to pursue him? It is impossible. One might as well try to overtake the winds or confine a mountain stream with a straw. I saw him too. He was free last night. I do not know what you mean, replied my brother in accents of wonder. But to us the discovery we have made completes our misery. No one would believe it at first, and even now Elizabeth will not be convinced, notwithstanding all the evidence. Indeed, who would credit that Justine Moritz, who was so amiable and fond of all the family, could suddenly become so capable of so frightful, so appalling a crime? Justine Moritz? Poor girl, is she the accused? But it is wrongly, everyone knows that. No one believes it, surely, Ernest. No one did at first, but several circumstances came out that have almost forced conviction upon us, and her own behavior has been so confused as to add to the evidence of fact a weight that I fear leaves no hope for doubt. But she will be tried today, and then you will hear all. He then related that on the morning on which the murder of poor William had been discovered, Justine had been taken ill and confined to her bed for several days. During this interval, one of the servants, happening to examine the apparel she had worn on the night of the murder, had discovered in her pocket the picture of my mother, which had been judged to be the temptation of the murderer. The servant instantly showed it to one of the others, who, without saying a word to any of the family, went to a magistrate, and upon their deposition, Justine was apprehended. On being charged with the fact, the poor girl confirmed the suspicion in a great measure by her extreme confusion of manner. This was a strange tale, but it did not shake my faith, and I replied earnestly, "You are all mistaken. I know the murderer. Justine, poor good Justine, is innocent." At that instant, my father entered. I saw unhappiness deeply impressed on his countenance, but he endeavored to welcome me cheerfully, and after we had exchanged our mournful greeting, would have introduced some other topic than that of our disaster, had not Ernest exclaimed, "Good God, Papa! Victor says he knows who was the murderer of poor William." "We do also, unfortunately," replied my father. "For indeed I had rather have been forever ignorant than to have discovered so much depravity and ingratitude in one I valued so highly." "My dear father, you are mistaken. Justine is innocent. If she is, God forbid that she should suffer as guilty. She is to be tried today, and I sincerely hope that she will be acquitted." This speech calmed me. I was firmly convinced in my own mind that Justine, and indeed every human being, was guiltless of this murder. Dude. People can murder. Bad news. I had no fear, therefore, that any circumstantial evidence could be brought forward strong enough to convict her. My tale was not one to announce publicly. Its astounding horror would be looked upon as madness by the vulgar. Madness! Did anyone exist except I, the Creator, who would believe, unless his senses convinced him, in the existence of the living monument of presumption and rash ignorance which I had let loose upon the world? He's very mean about the monster.
For real!
The wretch, the demon, the monument of presumption and rash ignorance.
I'm like, you made him. You don't even know anything about him.
I know. We were soon joined by Elizabeth. Time had altered her since I last beheld her. It had endowed her with the loveliness surpassing the beauty of her childish years. Anyways.
Little Frankie doesn't like that.
There was the same candor, the same vivacity, but it was allied to an expression more full of sensibility and intellect. She welcomed me with the greatest affection. "Your arrival, my dear cousin," she said, "fills me with hope. You, perhaps, will find some means to justify my poor guiltless Justine. Alas, who is safe if she be convicted of crime? I rely on her innocence as certainly as I do upon my own. Our misfortune is doubly hard to us. We have not only lost that lovely darling boy, but this poor girl whom I sincerely love is to be torn away by an even worse fate. If she is condemned, I shall never know joy. I never shall know joy more." I think Elizabeth might be a little into Justine. Just saying. "But she will not, I am sure she will not. And then I shall be happy again, even after the sad death of my little William." "She is innocent, my Elizabeth," said I, "and that shall be proved. Fear nothing, but let your spirits be cheered by the assurance of her acquittal." "How kind and generous you are. Everyone else believes in her guilt, and that made me wretched, for I knew that it was impossible, and to see everyone else prejudiced in so deadly a manner rendered me hopeless and despairing." She wept. "Dearest niece," said my father, "dry your tears. If she is as you believe innocent, rely on the justice of our laws and the activity with which I shall prevent the slightest shadow of partiality." I do like how Victor Frankenstein immediately is like, clearly the monster killed her, when really it could have been one of the servants who so conveniently found the picture. in her pocket, because she wasn't the one who put it there. Then who was?
What kind of investigation is this?
I mean, it was the 1700s, so I'm not really too. They're not very good at this. Anyways, chapter 8. We passed a few sad hours until 11 o'clock when the trial was to commence. My father and the rest of the family being obliged to attend as witnesses, I accompanied them to the court. During the whole of this wretched mockery of justice, I suffered living torture. It was to be decided whether the result of my curiosity and lawless devices would cause the death of 2 of my fellow beings. One, a smiling babe full of innocence and joy, the other far more dreadfully murdered, with every aggravation of infamy that could make the murder memorable in horror. Justine also was a girl of merit and possessed qualities which promised to render her life happy. Now all was to be obliterated in an ignominious grave, and I the cause. 1,000 times rather would I have confessed myself guilty of the crime ascribed to Justine, but I was absent when it was committed, and such a declaration would have been considered as the ravings of a madman, and would not have exculpated her who suffered through me. The appearance of Justine was calm. She was dressed in mourning, and her countenance, always engaging, was rendered by the solemnity of her feelings exquisitely beautiful. He only knows beautiful women, except for that one ugly sister. Yet she appeared confident in innocence and did not tremble, although gazed on and excoriated by thousands, for all the kindness which her beauty might otherwise have excited was obliterated in the minds of the spectators by the imagination of the enormity she was supposed to have committed. She was tranquil, yet her tranquility was evidently constrained, and as her confession had before been adduced as a proof of her guilt, she worked up her mind to an appearance of courage. When she entered the court, she threw her eyes round it and quickly discovered where we were seated. A tear seemed to dim her eye when she saw us, but she quickly recovered herself. A look of sorrowful affection seemed to attest her utter guiltlessness. So just saying, plenty of guilty people know how to look innocent. This is where my true crime background comes into play. I'm judging the investigators. I'm judging Justine. It could be anything. The trial began, and after the advocate against her had stated the charge, several witnesses were called. Several strange facts combined against her, which might have staggered anyone who had not such proof of her innocence as I had. You have no proof, dude. Okay. She had been out the whole of the night on which the murder had been committed, and towards morning had been perceived by a market woman not far from the spot where the body of the murdered child had been afterwards found. The woman asked her what she did there, but she looked very strangely and only returned a confused and unintelligible answer. She returned to the house about 8 o'clock, and when one inquired where she had passed the night, she replied that she had been looking for the child and demanded earnestly if anything had been heard concerning him. When shown the body, she fell into violent hysterics and kept her bed for several days. The picture was then produced which the servant had found in her pocket, and when Elizabeth, in a faltering voice, proved that it was the same which an hour before the child had been missed she had placed round his neck, a murmur of horror and indignation filled the court. Justine was called on for her defense. As the trial had proceeded, her countenance had altered. Surprise, horror, and misery were strongly expressed. Sometimes she struggled with her tears, but when she was desired to plead, she collected her powers and spoke in an audible although variable voice. God knows, she said, how entirely I am innocent, but I do not pretend that my protestations should acquit me. I rest my innocence on a plain and simple explanation of the facts which have been adduced against me, and I hope the character I have always borne will incline my judges to a favorable interpretation where any circumstance appears doubtful or suspicious. She then related that, by the permission of Elizabeth, she had passed the evening of the night on which the murder had been committed at the house of an aunt in Cheyenne, a village situated about a league from Geneva. On her return, at about 9 o'clock, she met a man who asked her if she had seen anything of the child who was lost. She was alarmed by this account and passed several hours in looking for him, when the gates of Geneva were shut, and she was forced to remain several hours of the night in a barn belonging to a cottage, being unwilling to call up the inhabitants to whom she was well known. Most of the night she spent here watching. Towards morning, she believed that she slept for a few minutes. Some steps disturbed her, and she awoke. It was dawn, and she quitted her asylum, that she might again endeavor to find my brother. If she had gone near the spot where his body lay, it was without her knowledge. That she had been bewildered when questioned by the market woman was not surprising, since she had passed a sleepless night and the fate of poor William was yet uncertain. Concerning the picture, she could give no account. I know, continued the unhappy victim, how heavily and fatally this one circumstance weighs against me, but I have no power of explaining it, and when I have expressed my utter ignorance, I am only left to conjecture concerning the probabilities by which it might have been placed in my pocket. Justine is a better detective than the detectives, just saying. But here also I am checked. I believe that I have no enemy on earth, and none surely would have been so wicked as to destroy me wantonly. Did the murderer place it there? I know of no opportunity afforded him for doing so. You're assuming it's a man. Sorry. Whoa, we're going in. Or if I had, why should he have stolen the jewel to part with it again so soon? I commit my cause to the justice of my judges, yet I see no room for hope. I beg permission to have a few witnesses examined concerning my character, and if their testimony should not overweigh my supposed guilt, I must be condemned, although I would pledge my salvation on my innocence. Several witnesses were called who had known her for many years, and they spoke well of her, but fear and hatred of the crime of which they supposed her guilty rendered them timorous and unwilling to come forward. Elizabeth saw even this last resort, her excellent dispositions and irreproachable conduct, about to fail the accused, when, although violently agitated, she desired permission to address the court. I am, said she, the cousin of the unhappy child who was murdered, or rather his sister, for I was educated by and have lived with his parents ever since and even long before his birth. It may therefore be judged indecent in me to come forward on this occasion, but when I see a fellow creature about to perish through the cowardice of her pretended friends, I wish to be allowed to speak, that I may say what I know of her character. I am well acquainted with the accused. I have lived in the same house with her, at one time for 5 and at another for nearly 2 years. During all that period, she appeared to me the most amiable and benevolent of human creatures. She nursed Madame Frankenstein, my aunt, in her last illness, with the greatest affection and care, and afterwards attended her own mother during a tedious illness in a manner that excited the admiration of all who knew her, after which she again lived in my uncle's house, where she was beloved by all the family. She was warmly attached to the child who is now dead, and acted towards him like a most affectionate mother. For my own part, I do not hesitate to say that, notwithstanding all the evidence produced against her, I believe and rely on her perfect innocence. She had no temptation for such an action. As to the bauble on which the chief proof rests, if she had earnestly desired it, I should have willingly given it to her. So much do I esteem and value her. So at no point in time have they mentioned whether or not they checked the handprint on the dead kid's throat to see if it matched Justine. Just saying.
And that would be like a huge difference, like if it's like
a
man
big
person.
hand.
Yeah.
Versus her hand.
Right.
It's the OJ trying to put the glove on. But like, yeah, like you could at least present me some physical evidence.
No. Nah, we don't need that.
No, we're just gonna like listen to people talk and then make a judgment.
It's like vibes.
It's
you know,
vibes
like,
only.
Yeah.
Vibes only, sorry. This is like the part where I'm like, oh, I know how this should go. A murmur of approbation followed Elizabeth's simple and powerful appeal, but it was excited by her generous interference and not in favor of poor Justine, on whom the public indignation was turned with renewed violence, charging her with the blackest ingratitude. She herself wept as Elizabeth spoke, but she did not answer. My own agitation and anguish was extreme during the whole trial. I believed in her innocence. I knew it. Could the demon who had, I did not for a minute doubt, murdered my brother, also in his hellish sport, have betrayed the innocent to death and ignominy?
See, that's one of those anemone words.
It's the anemone
yes.
words. I could not sustain the horror of my situation, and when I perceived that the popular voice and the countenances of the judges had already condemned my unhappy victim, I rushed out of the court in agony, not even doing anything to help. The tortures of the accused did not equal mine. She was sustained by innocence, but the fangs of remorse tore my bosom and would not forego their hold. I passed a night of unmingled wretchedness. In the morning I went to the court. My lips and throat were parched. I dared not ask the fatal question, but I was known, and the officer guessed the cause of my visit. The ballots had been thrown. They were all black, and Justine was condemned.
Dang.
I cannot pretend to describe what I then felt. I had before experienced sensations of horror, and I had endeavored to bestow upon them adequate expressions. But words cannot convey an idea of the heart-sickening despair that I then endured. The person to whom I addressed myself added that Justine had already confessed her guilt. That evidence, he observed, was hardly required in so glaring a case. I don't agree, but sure. But I am glad of it, and indeed none of our judges like to condemn a criminal upon circumstantial evidence, be it ever so decisive.
What?
Just saying. It was entirely circumstantial.
That's all this is.
They didn't even mention the fact that there was a handprint on the kid's throat.
Vibes.
Vibes only. Thank God I was never accused, like back in time, accused of being. This is just like the 1700s version of being accused of being a witch. Like Justine just had a witch trial. This was strange and unexpected intelligence. What could it mean? Had my eyes deceived me? And was I really as mad as the whole world would believe me to be if I disclosed the object of my suspicions? I hastened to return home, and Elizabeth eagerly demanded the result. My cousin, replied I, it is decided as you may have expected. All judges had rather that 10 innocent should suffer than 1 guilty should escape, but she has confessed. This was a dire blow to poor Elizabeth, who had relied with firmness upon Justine's innocence. Alas, said she, how shall I ever again believe in human goodness? Justine, whom I loved and esteemed as my sister, how could she put on those smiles of innocence only to betray? Her mild eyes seemed incapable of any severity or guile, and yet she has committed a murder. Are we sure? Like, if she only confessed after she was found guilty, are we sure? Just saying. I'm just presenting questions to the court. Soon after, we heard that the poor victim had expressed a desire to see my cousin. My father wished her not to go, but said that he left it to her own judgment and feelings to decide. Yes, said Elizabeth, I will go, although she is guilty, and you, Victor, shall accompany me. I cannot go alone. The idea of this visit was torture to me, yet I could not refuse. We entered the gloomy prison chamber and beheld Justine sitting on some straw at the further end. Her hands were manacled, and her head rested on her knees. She rose on seeing us enter, and when we were left alone with her, she threw herself at the feet of Elizabeth, weeping bitterly. My cousin wept also. Oh, Justine, said she, why did you rob me of my last consolation? I relied on your innocence, and although I was then very wretched, I was not so miserable as I am now. And do you also believe that I am so very, very wicked? Do you also join with my enemies to crush me, to condemn me as a murderer? Her voice was suffocated with sobs. Rise, my poor girl, said Elizabeth. Why do you kneel if you are innocent? I am not one of your enemies. I believed you guiltless, notwithstanding every evidence, until I heard that you had yourself declared your guilt. That report, you say, is false, and be assured, dear Justine, that nothing can shake my confidence in you for a moment but your own confession. I did confess, but I confessed a lie. I confessed that I might obtain absolution, but now that falsehood lies heavier in my heart than all my other sins. The God of heaven forgive me. Ever since I was condemned, my confessor has besieged me. He threatened and menaced until I almost began to think that I was the monster that he said I was. This is just like a real bad mark. You can tell Mary Shelley was oppressed. He threatened excommunication and hellfire in my last moments if I continued obdurate. Dear lady, I had none to support me. All looked on me as a wretch doomed to ignominy and perdition. What could I do? In an evil hour I subscribed to a lie, and now only am I truly miserable. If she confessed to a priest in confession, guess what is technically not supposed to be released to anyone? Confession. Yep. She paused, weeping, and then continued. I thought with horror, my sweet lady, that you should believe your Justine, whom your blessed aunt had so highly honored, and whom you loved, was a creature capable of a crime which none but the devil himself could have perpetrated. Dear William, dearest blessed child, I soon shall see you again in heaven, where we shall all be happy, and that consoles me, going as I am to suffer ignominy and death. Keep using that word. Oh, Justine, forgive me for having for one moment distrusted you. Why did you confess? But do not mourn, dear girl, do not fear. I will proclaim, I will prove your innocence. I will melt the stony hearts of your enemies by my tears and prayers. You shall not die. You, my playfellow, my companion, my sister, perish on the scaffold? No, I never could survive so horrible a misfortune. I'm sorry, are they girlfriends? I'm pretty sure they're girlfriends. Just saying, pretty sure they're girlfriends. And honestly, I like that a lot more. Like, please.
Just like a weird incestuous all around.
I mean, to be fair, they were both stolen by Madame Frankenstein. Justine shook her head mournfully. I do not fear to die, she said. That pang is past. God raises my weakness and gives me courage to endure the worst. I leave a sad and bitter world, and if you remember me and think of me as one unjustly condemned, I am resigned to the fate awaiting me. Learn from me, dear lady, to submit in patience to the will of heaven. During this conversation, I had retired to a corner of the prison room where I could conceal the horrid anguish that possessed me. Once again, Victor, there's something you can do about this. Despair? Who dared talk of that? The poor victim, who on the morrow was to pass the awful boundary between life and death, felt not as I did such deep and bitter agony. I gnashed my teeth and ground them together, uttering a groan that came from my inmost soul. Justine started. When she saw who it was, she approached me and said, "Dear sir, you are very kind to visit me. You, I hope, do not believe that I am guilty?" I could not answer. "No, Justine," said Elizabeth. "He is more convinced of your innocence than I was, for even when he heard that you had confessed, he did not credit it." I truly thank him. In these last moments, I feel the sincerest gratitude towards those who would think of me with kindness. How sweet is the affection of others to such a wretch as I am. It removes more than half my misfortune, and I feel as if I could die in peace now that my innocence is acknowledged by you, dear lady, and your cousin. Thus the poor sufferer tried to comfort others and herself. She indeed gained the resignation she desired. But I, the true murderer, never felt the never-dying worm alive in my bosom, which allowed of no hope or consolation. Elizabeth also wept and was unhappy, but hers was also the misery of innocence, which, like a cloud that passes over the fair moon, for a while hides but cannot tarnish its brightness. Anguish and despair had penetrated into the core of my heart. I bore a hell within me which nothing could extinguish. We stayed several hours with Justine, and it was with great difficulty that Elizabeth could tear herself away. "I wish," cried she, "that I were to die with you, as I cannot live in this world of misery." Justine assumed an air of cheerfulness, while she with difficulty repressed her bitter tears. She embraced Elizabeth and said in a voice of half-suppressed emotion, "Farewell, sweet lady, dearest Elizabeth, my beloved and only friend. May heaven in its bounty bless and preserve you. May this be the last misfortune that you will ever suffer. Live and be happy, and make others so." And on the morrow, Justine died. Elizabeth's heart-rending eloquence failed to move the judges from their settled conviction in the criminality of the saintly sufferer. My passionate and indignant appeals were lost upon them, and when I received their cold answers and heard the harsh, unfeeling reasoning of these men, my purposed avowal died away on my lips. Thus I might proclaim myself a madman, but not revoke the sentence passed upon my wretched victim. She perished on the scaffold as a murderess. From the tortures of my own heart, I turned to contemplate the deep and voiceless grief of my Elizabeth. This also was my doing, and my father's woe, and the desolation of that late so smiling home, all was the work of my thrice accursed hands. Ye weep, unhappy ones, but these are not your last tears. Again shall you raise the funeral wail, and the sound of your lamentations shall again and again be heard. Frankenstein, your son, your kinsman, your early much-loved friend, he who would spend each vital drop of blood for your sakes, who has no thought nor sense of joy except as it mirrored also in your dear countenances, who would fill the air with blessings and spend his life serving you, he bids you weep, to shed countless tears, happy beyond his hopes, if thus inexorable fate be satisfied, than if the destruction pause before the peace of the grave has succeeded to your sad torments. Thus spoke my prophetic soul, as, torn by remorse, horror, and despair, I beheld those I loved spend vain sorrow upon the graves of William and Justine, the first hapless victims to my unhallowed arts. Done! Yeah, so now literally 2 people have died because Victor Frankenstein thought he could bring a creature to life. And that is the danger of science. We love science. Science is great. Just don't try to bring creatures to life.
Don't try to play God.
Don't try to play God. Exactly.
Universal man.
Universal man. Thank you so much for joining us for not only an episode of Lunchtime Listens Frankenstein, but also for a court report on the state of Swiss justice in the 1700s. But if you missed part of today's episode or you want to catch up on our other episodes of Lunchtime Listens, this episode and all of our other episodes will be up on our YouTube channel. This one will go up there on Thursday. And once again, I am Anne.
I'm Christina.
Thank you so much for joining us and have a great rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye.